February 17th, 1945. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima lay shrouded in morning mist, its black sand beaches deceptively quiet beneath the grey Pacific sky. Deep within the island's honeycomb of tunnels and reinforced caves, Japanese soldiers crouched in darkness, their hands steady on rifles they had cleaned countless times in the humid gloom. The acrid smell of sulphur from the island's volcanic vents mixed with the metallic tang of weapons oil and the musty earth of underground fortifications. Above them, 18 miles of interconnected tunnels carved from solid rock represented the culmination of 2 decades of jungle warfare mastery, a defensive system so sophisticated that its architect, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, believed it would bleed the Americans white. For 24 hours, American naval guns had pounded the island with a ferocity unprecedented in Pacific warfare. Yet in the depths of their subterranean fortress, the Japanese defenders waited with the patience of men who had spent their military careers perfecting the art of fighting from shadows. They had learned to move like ghosts through tropical undergrowth in Malaya, to strike without warning in the jungles of Burma, to melt away into the green hell of the Philippines. Their training manuals spoke of jungle warfare as a science, every branch a potential firing position, every ravine a defensive stronghold, every approach a killing ground to be studied and memorized. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the inheritors of a military doctrine forged in the crucible of Asian conquest, tempered by victories that had stunned the Western world. When Japan's bicycle troops had raced through the supposedly impenetrable jungles of Malaya in 1942, outflanking British positions that military experts had deemed unassailable, they had proven that the jungle was not an obstacle but an ally. Their intelligence bulletins, captured after the WOW operations in New Guinea, revealed a methodical approach to jungle combat that bordered on the obsessive. Everything hostile forces do has a meaning. No matter how small the details, each is a part of a plan. The Japanese had spent the 1930s studying warfare in the green depths of Asia's tropical forests. Their training emphasized stealth over firepower, endurance over comfort, adaptation over rigid doctrine. They learned to read the jungle like a map, which their field manuals specified that uniforms should be dark green, that leather shoes were superior to rubber-soled footwear in jungle conditions, and that each section should carry as many hand grenades as possible, silent killers perfect for close-quarters combat in dense vegetation. This mastery had served them well in the early years of the Pacific War. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces had been overwhelmed by Japanese troops who seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and vanish back into the jungle before effective counterattacks could be mounted. The Malayan campaign had been a masterpiece of jungle warfare, with Japanese forces using bicycles to carry more equipment through terrain the British had considered impassable. In Burma, they had outmaneuvered larger Allied forces by moving through jungle paths that Western maps did not even acknowledge existed. The key to their success lay not just in tactical innovation, but in psychological adaptation. Japanese soldiers were trained to embrace the jungle's discomfort, the constant humidity that rotted equipment and infected wounds, the perpetual twilight beneath dense canopies that disoriented Western troops, the cacophony of insects and animals that masked the approach of death. Their intelligence reports analyzed American fighting methods with clinical precision. US troops depend too much on their firepower and lack the will to fight, both physically and spiritually. Therefore, have confidence in your bayonet and lunge at your foe. But as the war progressed, Japanese jungle warfare expertise encountered an adversary they had not anticipated: American industrial capacity operating at a scale that defied comprehension. By 1943, American factories were producing military equipment at rates that Japanese military planners had deemed impossible. The United States manufactured 297,000 aircraft during the war, along with 193,000 artillery pieces and 86,000 tanks. More critically for jungle warfare, American industry began mass-producing specialized weapons, designed specifically to neutralize the advantages that terrain and concealment had traditionally provided to defending forces. The flamethrower represented everything Japanese jungle warfare doctrine was not. Where Japanese tactics emphasized stealth and patience, the flamethrower was brutally direct. Where jungle warfare relied on concealment and ambush, the flamethrower turned Worse still, the psychological impact was devastating. The sight of liquid fire consuming defensive positions that had taken weeks to construct shattered the morale of troops who had been trained to believe that proper camouflage and fieldcraft made them nearly invulnerable. American forces deployed the portable M2 flamethrower in combat for the first time during the Guadalcanal campaign in January 1943. Japanese intelligence reports captured after that battle revealed their shock at the weapon's effectiveness. The hostile forces are skilled in approaching by crawling, and they often get within 15 yards of our troops without being detected. They open surprise fire with very rapid-firing automatic weapons and deal destructive blows. But now these same hostile forces carried weapons that could kill at ranges where Japanese defensive tactics were most vulnerable. The evolution of American flamethrower tactics represented a systematic dismantling of Japanese jungle warfare advantages. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized the construction of interconnected defensive positions hidden in natural terrain, American forces used flamethrowers to clear 50-yard fields of fire around suspected enemy positions. The Japanese intelligence bulletin captured after the New Guinea operations noted with growing concern, "Hostile attacks in a wooded area will usually begin with automatic rifle fire. The effective range is about 50 yards. Therefore, we can neutralize this fire by clearing a 50-yard area in front of our positions." But clearing such areas made Japanese positions visible to American artillery observers, negating another fundamental principle of jungle warfare. Even more devastating than portable flamethrowers were the Sherman M4A3R3 Zippo tanks that American Seabees had modified with flamethrowing equipment. These armored vehicles combined the psychological terror of liquid fire with the protection necessary to operate in the killing grounds that Japanese defensive tactics created. Where individual flamethrower operators faced casualty rates approaching 90% in battles like Iwo Jima, the flamethrower tanks could approach enemy positions with relative impunity, methodically burning out defensive positions that had been designed to be impregnable to conventional assault. The Japanese had not anticipated the industrial scale of American flamethrower production. By 1945, the United States was manufacturing these weapons in quantity. American forces used flamethrowers not just to kill enemy soldiers, but to systematically destroy the environmental advantages that Japanese jungle warfare doctrine depended upon. Vegetation that provided concealment was burned away. Underground positions that had taken months to construct were filled with liquid fire that made them uninhabitable. The very landscape that Japanese forces had learned to read and exploit was transformed into a charred wasteland that offered no tactical advantages to either side. But American innovation went beyond flamethrowers. Bulldozer tanks represented an even more fundamental challenge to Japanese defensive philosophy. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized the construction of elaborate defensive positions integrated into natural terrain features, bulldozers simply removed the terrain itself. Positions that would have required weeks of costly infantry assaults to capture could be buried under tons of earth pushed by armored bulldozers operating under covering fire from supporting units. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Soldiers who had spent their careers mastering the art of jungle warfare found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight according to the rules they understood. Instead of attempting to infiltrate carefully prepared defensive positions, American forces simply destroyed the positions themselves, burning away concealment with flamethrowers, burying fortifications with bulldozers, and calling down artillery strikes on targets that had been exposed by the systematic removal of natural cover. The transformation was most visible on Iwo Jima, where General Kuribayashi had created what he believed to be the perfect synthesis of jungle warfare principles and defensive engineering. His tunnels and caves were designed to allow Japanese defenders to strike from concealment and withdraw before effective counterattacks could be organized. Classic jungle warfare tactics adapted to the volcanic terrain of a Pacific island. The interconnected tunnel system allowed rapid movement between defensive positions without exposure to American observation or fire. Dummy positions and decoy installations were constructed to draw American artillery fire away from real defensive sites. Every principle of jungle warfare that had served Japanese forces so well in the dense forests of Southeast Asia had been incorporated into Iwo Jima's defenses. Yet American forces methodically dismantled this sophisticated defensive system, using industrial-scale firepower and special flamethrower tanks pumped liquid fire into tunnel entrances that had been designed to be invisible to conventional reconnaissance. Bulldozers filled in cave openings that had taken months to excavate and fortify. Artillery strikes guided by forward observers eliminated defensive positions that had been carefully camouflaged according to jungle warfare principles that no longer provided effective protection. The Japanese discovered that their mastery of jungle warfare, perfected over decades of campaigns in Asia's tropical forests, had become a liability when confronted with an enemy that possessed both the industrial capacity to mass-produce specialized weapons and the tactical flexibility to employ those weapons in ways that negated traditional defensive advantages. The very skills that had made Japanese forces so effective in the early years of the Pacific War, patience, camouflage, the ability to remain motionless for hours while waiting for the perfect moment to strike, became death sentences when American flamethrower operators could simply burn entire areas without needing to locate specific enemy positions. The captured Japanese rice ball, found clutched in the charred hand of a defender on Iwo Jima, had been carefully wrapped in leaves and carried for days through the tunnel system. The rice, a symbol of Japanese cultural identity and military tradition, represented everything the defenders had expected to sustain them through the siege they had anticipated. They had planned to fight as their predecessors had fought in the jungles of Asia, using stealth and patience to bleed the Americans slowly, while preserving their own strength for decisive counterattacks. Instead, they found themselves facing liquid fire that turned their underground positions into furnaces, and bulldozers that buried alive soldiers who had survived naval bombardments that should have been lethal. The rice ball, now a blackened remnant, embodied the gap between Japanese expectations and American industrial reality. Where Japanese forces had prepared for a battle of attrition fought according to principles they had mastered over 2 decades of jungle warfare, American forces waged a campaign of systematic destruction, using weapons and tactics that rendered traditional defensive skills irrelevant. The careful preparation, the meticulous attention to camouflage and concealment, the patient discipline that had served Japanese forces so well in the green depths of Southeast Asian jungles, all of it was incinerated by weapons that American factories. The transformation of jungle warfare by American industrial power represented more than a tactical evolution. It marked the emergence of a new form of warfare where industrial capacity could overcome tactical expertise, where mass production could neutralize strategic patience, where the abundance of American manufacturing could defeat the refined skills that Japanese forces had spent decades perfecting. The soldiers who had learned to move like shadows through the jungles of Malaya and Burma found themselves confronting an enemy that simply burned away the shadows themselves. In the end, Japanese jungle warfare mastery proved inadequate not because the tactics were flawed, but because the strategic context had changed beyond recognition. American forces did not need to master the subtle arts of jungle combat when they could simply eliminate the jungle itself. They did not need to learn patience and stealth when they possessed the industrial capacity to overwhelm defensive positions with sustained firepower. The careful study of terrain and vegetation that Japanese doctrine emphasized became irrelevant when American bulldozers could reshape the terrain and flamethrowers could eliminate the vegetation. The volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, mixed with the ashes of burned vegetation and the remains of buried fortifications, became a testament to the collision between tactical mastery and industrial power. Japanese soldiers who had spent their careers learning to fight with precision and economy of force found themselves facing an enemy that could afford to expend resources on a scale that made traditional military calculations meaningless. Every gallon of flamethrower fuel, every hour of bulldozer operation, every artillery shell fired in preparatory bombardments represented a fraction of American industrial output, so small as to be statistically insignificant. This abundance, the ability to produce weapons in quantities that transformed warfare from a contest of skill to a demonstration of industrial capacity, became the ultimate symbol of American power in the Pacific. Where Japanese forces carried carefully rationed supplies and meticulously maintained equipment that could not easily be replaced, American forces operated with a logistical backing that seemed limitless to defenders who had grown accustomed to fighting with whatever materials they could scavenge or carry. The contrast was most visible in the aftermath of battle, when American forces could afford to abandon damaged equipment rather than repair it, while Japanese defenders fought with rifles. The rice ball found in the defender's hand represented not just cultural identity, but the careful rationing that Japanese forces had learned to accept as normal, each grain precious, each calorie calculated, each portion measured against uncertain supply lines and dwindling reserves. American abundance operated according to different principles entirely. Flamethrower fuel could be expended without concern for conservation, because more could be delivered by ships that carried supplies in quantities that Japanese logistics officers considered fantasy. Bulldozer operations could continue around the clock, because replacement parts and additional equipment were available in numbers that made operational planning a matter of scheduling, rather than careful resource allocation. The industrial democracy that produced these weapons in such overwhelming quantities represented a form of warfare that Japanese military doctrine had never confronted. American factories operated not under the control of military bureaucrats concerned with traditional resource allocation, but as expressions of an economic system that measured success by the ability to exceed previous production targets. The competition between American manufacturers to produce more effective weapons, to deliver supplies more efficiently, to solve logistical problems more creatively, created an innovative dynamic that Japanese centralized military planning could not match. This democratic abundance, the product of a society that rewarded innovation and efficiency rather than conformity to established doctrine, proved more decisive than tactical expertise or strategic patience. Japanese jungle warfare mastery represented the culmination of military professionalism developed over decades of careful study and practical experience. American industrial power represented something entirely different: the mobilization of an entire society's productive capacity in service of military objectives that transcended traditional strategic thinking. The burned rice ball, found among the ashes of Iwo Jima's defensive positions, symbolized more than the defeat of Japanese jungle warfare tactics. It represented the collision between two different concepts of military power, one based on the perfection of traditional skills, the other based on the transformation of industrial capacity into military advantage. The Japanese soldier who had carried that rice ball through miles of tunnels had embodied everything his military tradition valued: discipline, patience, skill, and the ability to endure hardship in service of strategy. Yet all of these virtues proved insufficient when confronted with an enemy that could simply overwhelm defensive positions with weapons produced in quantities that made individual skill irrelevant. The flamethrowers that killed him and the bulldozers that buried his position represented not superior tactical doctrine, but superior industrial organization. The ability of American society to mobilize resources on a scale that Japanese military planners had considered impossible. In the end, Japanese jungle warfare mastery died not in honorable combat between skilled opponents, but in the furnace of American industrial power, unleashed without restraint or reservation. The soldiers who had learned to fight like shadows in the green depths of Asia's jungles were consumed by liquid fire, mass-produced in factories they could not imagine, buried by bulldozers manufactured on assembly lines that operated according to principles their military education had never contemplated. The lesson etched in volcanic ash and burned vegetation was simple and terrible. In modern warfare, abundance trumps expertise. Industrial capacity defeats tactical mastery, and the ability to produce weapons faster than the enemy can construct defenses renders traditional military skills obsolete. The rice ball, blackened and forgotten in the ruins of Japanese ambition, bore silent witness to the transformation of warfare from an art practiced by skilled professionals into an expression of industrial power that recognized no limits save those imposed by productive capacity itself.